So this is my Swisher ESP storm shelter, which is an above ground shelter I just recently installed. And I wanted to share with everybody because obviously you have to be prepared for natural disasters or anything else that might occur. But I also want to talk about how this thing can withstand an EF5 tornado and how I got the government to pay for it. Well, at least 85% of it, which is a pretty big chunk of change. Now, this particular Swisher ESP Safety Shelter is a 6-person shelter and it costs $8,000, which is not inexpensive, and you can get it right from Midway USA, who is the biggest supporter of the channel, and thanks to them I'm able to work on projects like this one. But even better is the fact that because of their help, I was able to figure out how to get the government to subsidize 85% of the cost of this shelter. And I'm going to tell you all about that. I'm going to show you the inside of the shelter, give you all the specifications, talk about some suggestions I have about the shelter when it comes to installing it or what you might want to keep inside, and just some other things to keep in mind when it comes to some issues that I encountered during the installation and receiving process. But all in all, I'm really excited about this shelter because I don't have a basement and we do have tornadic activity out here, and I wanted a safe place to bring my family to in case of an extreme weather event. So let's get inside of this thing. I'll talk all about the specifications and hopefully give you some ideas about how maybe you can get the government to pay for one for you too. All right, before we go inside, let's talk about the specifications and capabilities of this storm shelter. First off, it meets all NSSA, FEMA 320, as well as P361 and ICC 500 requirements for tornado shelters, which means it will qualify for things like federal grants, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Now, this thing is made from 3/16" thick steel, and it's made in the USA, and it's carbon steel, and it feels very durable, and of course, it's been tested and rated to withstand EF5 tornadoes, which are pretty intense tornadoes, and I don't even think I'll get those out here, but hey, I want to make sure we have a little extra, right? Now, it's bolt together and modular, which you'll see once we go inside, but what's cool about that is just in case you end up moving or you want to move it somewhere else on your property, you could technically take this whole thing apart and move it somewhere else. So that is also a benefit. And then, of course, it doubles as something like a panic room as well. It doesn't just have to be a storm shelter, but primarily for my purposes, I'm using it as a storm shelter because I don't have a basement. So an above ground shelter was the way to go. And there are some benefits to an above ground shelter, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. But first off, let's get the tour going. I'll show you all around the shelter, show you inside of it, talk about how it was put together, and some things that I have regarding ideas about what you might want to keep inside in case you find yourself trapped in it. All right, let's take a look inside this thing so you can see what it's all about. And here you have it. Now, I do have a little battery-powered light up here. It does not come with a light. But this is the shelter. It's for 6 people, and it's not meant to stay in for a long period of time. It's just to protect you during a tornado. So let's talk about the door, the latch system, and everything else related to how it remains secure. All right, so right here we have the latch system on the door. It is latched right now. You can unlatch it, which then allows you to open the door. And there's these 3 pins right here, which are captured. And what they allow you to do is remove them if need be, but the door immediately closes and latches onto them. And as you can see, they move pretty freely in here, okay? Now, another thing to keep in mind is that once the door is closed, you have a deadbolt lock right here, which you can access from the outside with a key if you need to, which means you can lock this up and make it safe and secure if you were to store things in here. And then there's also the secondary locking pin right here. And so once you're inside, you're secure, and if there's a storm coming or you're using it as a panic room, you get all your latches locked in, which they automatically do. You lock your deadbolt, and then you have this locking pin right here, which goes right into this section right here, goes through the entirety of the door into the frame, turns down, and then fully locks in. So it's a really nice system because it's very fast. If you want to just get in and slam the door closed, you'll be locked in technically. And then you can pull this out, unlock your deadbolt, unlatch, and then you're good once again. And you can, of course, hands-free, don't have to operate the latch at all, just push it closed, and now you're in. So that's how the latching system works. I like it a lot. It was very easy, and this whole system on the door and on this corner over here, which has a shelving unit built in as well as the pins and everything else for the latch system, was already pre-assembled. So you didn't have to necessarily build all these different parts and components, but you do have to build the entire thing, which is its own thing. But I wanted to demonstrate that because it's a really easy to use door, especially with how heavy duty it is. And up here is the door system where it actually runs on a track. And I'll go ahead and demonstrate that here for you right now. As you can see, it's a hanging door that just runs on a track, which makes it really easy to operate. Here we have the shielded vents right here. They got a couple of them in each corner as well as down at the bottom. Now, another really cool benefit of this shelter is that it has emergency access panels, which you see right here. There's a small panel on top, as well as a much larger one on the bottom. And then I have another one over here on this side. And the whole point of these is that you can remove them from the inside in case your door gets obstructed by maybe your house caved in or who knows what else. So if you can't get out of the door, you can remove these panels from inside and actually leave the shelter. And of course, there's a wrench that you keep inside of the shelter that allows you to do just that. So it's really nice having the additional escape routes if needed, especially since in a tornado, there's a good chance that there's going to be debris or possibly a cave-in. And just so you guys know, I'm 6'3" and I fit in here. So just keep that in mind in case you're worried about whether or not this will be tall enough for you. Now here are some suggestions for you, just in case you get a shelter like this, as to what you might want to put in it and other considerations to make. So I'm going to put a 5-gallon bucket in here with a liner in it, just in case we get trapped in here for a longer amount of time than we anticipated and somebody has to use the bathroom. That bucket's also going to have emergency radios in it, some water, as well as some first aid supplies. So that's something you might want to have. You also are supposed to have hearing protection inside this shelter, because if the wind event is strong enough, it can actually damage your hearing. So I'm going to have some hearing protection in here as well. Another thing I would suggest is probably notifying your local authorities or your local first responders so that they're aware of the fact that you have a tornado shelter, so that if there is any tornadic activity, they can come check on you and make sure you're not trapped inside. And then another thing you can consider is that with these Swisher ESP Safety Shelters, they actually offer accessories like benches or gun racks and other things you can add onto it if you want. But I'm going to actually take a gym mat and cut it to size and put it in here just so the floor has a little bit of cushioning and allows us to all sit down on the floor or whatever it might be in case we're in here for a longer amount of time. So these are all considerations to make, but let's talk about some issues I ran into during the installation, as well as some of the other things you might want to consider before you purchase something like this. And then I'll tell you all about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, where you can actually get the government to pay for a substantial amount of the shelter. All right, so there were some potential issues that you need to be aware of in case you find yourself getting a shelter like this one. I just want to make sure you're very aware of these things and I'm transparent about everything I ran into during this process, because it's a big, big shelter that weighs thousands of pounds. So on the truck delivery, all of the pallets that it was shipped on were completely broken. Okay, and you have to be able to accept freight if you order a shelter like this one, so make sure you can actually do that. But here's the thing. Usually they can just wheel these out on a pallet jack and then you can deal with the rest. But because all the pallets broke under the weight of this shelter, me and the truck driver had to literally unload it all by hand, one piece at a time. So that happened, and that's something that you should be aware of, could be a possibility for you as well, okay? Now, another thing to keep in mind is that drilling the holes for the anchor bolts into the foundation was an awful experience. They give you a template that shows you exactly where to drill. It works in that regard. However, if you have a basic hammer drill and you have the correct bits, you are going to have to take a lot of time to get through this process. I think I counted 25 anchor bolt pilot holes that you have to drill, and honestly, it was a nightmare. It took me a very long time to get through. I would probably hire somebody or who knows what else, but that is not something you're going to do in one day. So please keep that in mind, especially if you don't have the right equipment.
I'm just going to take a guess and say that drilling the holes into this cement foundation is probably the worst part of building this entire structure. So I would rent like a giant SDS drill from Home Depot or hire some helpful hands if you can, because this process has been awful. But I'm just guessing that right now. Who knows if it'll actually be the hardest part, but I'm just warning you now that drilling these holes into your concrete foundation is not a good time. Even if you have a hammer drill with the proper bits and everything else, it's not as easy as it's supposed to sound.
Here are the concrete anchors that you have to install in the holes you drill into the foundation. They have to be tightened to 40 foot-pounds, so yeah, you'll need a torque wrench. But this was a difficult task. This is not something you're going to be able to just bust out in 20 minutes. So just be aware of that. But once these things are tightened down and bolted in, this thing is going nowhere. Now, I also have in-floor heating here, so I had to use a thermal device in order to avoid puncturing any of those in-floor heating lines, which I actually did not puncture any, so that worked out well. But just keep that in mind too. You need to know what's underneath your floor just in case. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that you not only are going to need to take your time, but you're going to need some help. And they do suggest having 2 to 3 people help you with this. I'm a little stubborn and impatient, so of course I try to do a lot of stuff on my own, but luckily my wife helped me with a huge amount of the construction on this thing. So you're either gonna need some additional guys or you're gonna need to start lifting some weights, because honestly, like, this was a struggle. Like, this thing is really, really heavy, and I'm just lucky that I'm a 6'3", 210-pound guy in pretty good shape. But otherwise, I don't know if somebody else would be able to just move this thing around as easily, because it was a struggle for me, all right? So I wanted to make sure you're aware of those things, just in case you find yourself wanting to get the shelter, that you should expect those issues to be a real problem at some point in time. But in all reality, I still got it figured out, it's still built, and I still got everything taken care of. So not trying to deter you, just want you to be prepared for your expectations to be realistic. Now, why an above-ground shelter as opposed to a below-ground shelter? Well, a below-ground shelter would definitely help you with something like nuclear fallout, which this will not help you with, unfortunately. But everything else related to what this is designed for, tornadic activity, is actually better with an above-ground shelter in many ways. First off, they're being tested to show that they survive or withstand EF5 level tornadoes just the same as a below-ground shelter. But they also mitigate some additional risks, like flooding. If a below-ground shelter floods, which during tornadoes there's generally a lot of rain, you're in a really tight situation, whereas an above-ground shelter has a very, very low chance of allowing you to drown in it. Another thing to keep in mind is that it's very easy to get into. I can run out in my garage, jump inside this door, and be good to go. Whereas in a below-ground shelter, it's harder to get into, and people who are either handicapped or need to use like a walker or a wheelchair to get around might not be able to get into a below-ground shelter as easily as this. So those are all considerations to make. Now, it also has some benefits in regards to administration. What do I mean by that? Well, depending on where you live, your city, your county, your municipality, you might not necessarily need a permit to install an above-ground shelter, whereas you're most likely going to need something if you start breaking ground. Now, that's all dependent on your area, so don't quote me on that just in case you do need a permit, but there is less of a chance of needing one with an above-ground shelter than a below-ground shelter. And another thing to keep in mind is that when you're applying for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, because I didn't have to break any new ground, I didn't have to start digging, I installed this shelter in a garage in a pre-existing structure that had a pre-existing foundation, it was much easier to apply for that grant program because of that. So that's another benefit of the above ground storm shelter. So let's talk about some other things related to the shelter that you might want to know about. All right, let's talk about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is where you get 85% of this thing covered by the government when it comes to cost. And that's something that I would suggest you looking into, because it's not an inexpensive unit, but it was worth getting if I only had to spend 15% of my own money. Okay, so let's talk about how that works. First off, you gotta begin with your state level hazard mitigation officers. You're gonna have to do some research on your own and start reaching out to people. And the only reason this process was able to be started was because I started sending messages saying, hey, are there any grant programs available for residential storm shelters? And in fact, there are, but most people don't realize they need to actually reach out and start this process. So your hazard mitigation state level officer is somebody you're going to want to look up. And then you're also going to need to contact your county emergency manager. And then those people are going to work together on this process with you, or at least that was my experience here in North Dakota. And then they will process the request through FEMA for you. So I didn't have to personally interact with FEMA at all. They're taking care of all of that processing. Now, the application asks for a ton of questions, photos. They want pictures of the location where it's going to be installed. They want pictures of your home in the sense of like a GPS location. They want a Google Maps image of where this is getting installed. They want the total cost of everything. They want the work schedule as to how long it'll take and what the expectations are on turnaround time, which mine was incorrect on based on some preconceived notions of enthusiasm. But they also want solicitation letters. And what do I mean by solicitation letters? Well, they are letters from different bureaucracies or local entities that say they can allow you to install this shelter. And so what that was them trying to cross their T's and dot their I's when it came to different entities like historical societies or fish and game, and just making sure you're not disrupting an environment or disrupting a historical site or whatever it is. So I had to go and get a bunch of letters from all these different branches in order to say that everything was good to go for me to install this shelter. And this was all part of the FEMA application process. So this is just something I had to do and steps I had to take. This is why this process took quite a while. I also had to go to the county commission and get approval for the project. Now, the money doesn't come out of your county, but everything has to get processed through your county. So the state as well as FEMA are processing money through the county for you, but your county still has to approve it. So I had to go to the county commission and they all voted on whether or not to approve this measure, and they did. So I appreciate my county for doing that for me. Now, I'm going to be the first person in North Dakota to ever get this storm shelter grant, which means nobody's accessing this, but it's accessible to the public. So you need to look into it because it's something that you could actually do. If I'm capable of it, you most certainly are. I will be the first person in North Dakota to do this. And what's great about it is that FEMA reimburses 75% of the cost and the state reimburses 10% of the cost. And then I just have to pay the final 15%. Now, it is a reimbursement, which means you will pay for the total cost of everything up front and then be reimbursed thereafter once installation has been guaranteed and once there's proof of installation, and they may or may not request an inspection. So these are all things to keep in mind, but this process is not a short process. In order to qualify for this grant and in order to get everything to go through the way it had to, it took me almost a year. So if you're interested in doing this, make sure you start the process now. And a big consideration to make here is that I started the process before buying this shelter. You actually can't put the shelter in or even purchase a shelter before starting the process. FEMA will not move forward on a grant program if you've already installed the shelter. So that's another consideration to make because I had to put all this time and effort into doing research and photos and contacting all these different entities and then back and forth communications with my state hazard mitigation officer and everyone else involved before I ever even got to buy the shelter, before I ever even started installing it. But I think all of that is worth it when it comes down to only having to pay 15% of the cost personally and allowing the state and FEMA to reimburse me for 75 or 85% of the cost, which, you know, it's our tax money anyway, so might as well get it because they're sending it everywhere else anyway, right? So that is how my hazard mitigation grant program situation worked out and why I wanted to share this with everybody, because there's not many opportunities out there to get something as practical for preparedness as a storm shelter and have the government actually help you pay for it. And this is one of those situations where that might be worth the cost because now my family has somewhere safe to be during a tornado, whereas before we really didn't. I mean, we had a place to be, but it just wasn't as substantial as this. And we don't have a basement, so I needed something that could actually protect us, and now we have it. So let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, if you have any concerns or any thought processes related to this entire project. Let me know what you would do in the sense of using this shelter for more than maybe just a tornado. Are there other ideas you have in mind for what it might be worthy of? And I also want to let you know that if you have questions about the hazard mitigation grant program or anything else related to it, like just leave it in the comments. I'll do my best to answer, but you probably just need to start doing some research because it is a complicated process. And it's not something that I am overly comfortable telling you how to do because, I mean, I needed a lot of help to get through it by my state hazard mitigation officer and my county emergency manager. So be aware of that, but I hope this gave you some interesting things to consider. Even if you're not in the market for a storm shelter, now you're aware of the fact that these residential grants exist and you can access them, but nobody's doing it. So you might as well, because look, if I'm the only person to ever even try to do it here in North Dakota, I'm sure it's the same way in many other states. So let me know if you have any questions for me. Anything else at all, go to magicprepper.com. And besides that, it's going to be it for Magic Prepper.